All right. Hello, John. Hello, Mary. Glad you two are here.
Mary, it's a great pleasure to meet you.
It's a great pleasure to meet you too, John. It's especially nice to meet you face to face after watching you for so long. I do feel like I know you pretty well from listening to so many of your lectures.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Mary. Obviously, we have some differences, but you often present my views in a very fair and clear manner, and I'm very grateful for that. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you in person for that.
Oh, well, you're welcome, and I have to definitely thank you. I feel like I have so many thoughts in my head, and you put a lot of them there.
Well, that's great.
I don't think I've ever had so many thoughts in my head in my whole life.
It's been one of the gifts of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series to get that reaction from a lot of people. I mean, obviously, I have a particular argument, and I'm arguing for it. But I can honestly also say this: that my primary goal was to really give people tools, ways to think, and ways to reflect, and ways to transform themselves. And a lot of people have actually said that back to me, that I've given them things to think and new vocabulary and new grammar, and so that's very encouraging to me. It's very gratifying to hear. So thank you for saying that.
Okay, I want to start off with saying something. There's something that you said that has struck me, and I have often thought about it, and I think it might be a good place for us to start. And that is, you've talked about when you have this, your personal inclination is toward a non-theistic metaphysics. And one of the reasons you've put that forward is you've said that you don't want to privilege one group of people over another, one group of people's experience over another.
Yeah, experience of sacredness, yes.
Right. And one of the ways that I've heard that is I've heard that Christians have been arrogant and prideful, and that has hurt other people, and that they have been dismissive of others' experiences, and have taken what should be accepted by them as a gratuitous gift and put it into their own minds and hearts as some sort of point of superiority. And I want to just say that has struck me very deeply. And I think if we all could hear that point and let it sink into our hearts, that I think that would make, regardless of anything else that happens with this, that would really be transformative in itself.
Well, thank you for saying that, Mary. You let me know that you and I have shared a background of coming up in a religion that was in some ways oppressive to us, if you'll allow me that word. And so the way you just phrased that was personally very meaningful to me, because I was certainly brought up with that portrayal. I was even brought up being taught that all of the other religions were demonic creations designed to send people to hell. And so now I want to acknowledge right now that I am not tarring all Christians with that brush. If I did, I wouldn't be here talking to you two. So it's clear that I do not believe that. I'm not talking about my beliefs. I'm talking about my past and what I grew up with and how it has affected me. So I definitely want to acknowledge, and I'm happy to talk about that more personal aspect. So responding to that personally and giving that priority, I think is great, and I deeply appreciate it. I don't, and I don't think you're implying this. I don't want to imply that my only reasons for taking a non-theistic stance are just that I've been personally traumatized by a particular brand of Christianity. I do have arguments, and I'd like to discuss them. But neither am I going to pretend that those arguments aren't enmeshed with my own psychological background. I don't want to identify them, and I don't want to ignore them. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
But I do acknowledge what you're saying. And one of the reasons why I take time to respond to you, Mary, is, and I've said this about Paul, is precisely because of some of the ways you've talked about your own background and where you come at it, and the good faith that you bring to the discussion. That's why I often reply when you make comments, because I think I have, I hope this isn't presumptuous on my part, but I think I have a fairly good understanding of where you're coming from. And so that's why I feel it's both safe and appropriate, safe in the sense of not misunderstanding you, and appropriate to respond. And also, you often have very insightful things to say.
Well, I wanted to lay that out there because I think that, and I'm not just talking about more fundamentalist or cultic type of groups, which I grew up in a cult. I grew up in the Jehovah's Witnesses,
Yes,
third generation, and which I would definitely identify as a cult, extremely abusive environment, both because of the sect, but also even just in as an additional layer of it, just in my family background.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
But I do even recognize it now as Catholic. I do even recognize it within the discourse amongst Catholics. I recognize it in the discourse amongst Christians in general. I think that it's something that, you know, the claims that we have as Christians are claims about God. They're not claims about us. They're not, they should never be claims about some sort of personal superiority. And if that's the kind of claim we're coming with, then we're doing it wrong.
Yes.
So I think we need to get past that somehow.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And I hope that these kinds of good faith dialogues between people on various, I don't know what called sides of the aisle, perhaps, I don't know,
Yeah.
will help to make that possible. I mean, I've never felt that sense from JP, never felt it from Paul, never felt it from Jonathan. But yeah, there has been a long history of Christian, I don't know, something like Christian personal triumphalism or something like that. So, I mean, I know people aren't happy with this distinction. That's why I try to make this distinction, and I'd like to talk about it at some point, between trying to acknowledge how psychologically indispensable something might be, whether or not it's metaphysically necessary, and then what the relationship might be between them. But so before we get to the philosophical intricacies of that, I do want to indicate that one of the reasons why I talk about psychological indispensability, and remember, I include groups, not just individuals, under that category, is not just because I think it's a direct implication of the theory of relevance realization, but because it's a way of me trying to indicate the depth, I want to say more than sincerity, the psychological authenticity by which a lot of people hold their particular Christian beliefs. It's people think I'm using that term dismissively, and that's unfair to me. I'm not using the term dismissively. I don't mean to be conveying that. And so that's part of what I've been trying to get at. I'm trying to get at, can we come up with a way in which we can separate our commitment to these truths, or let's say the commitment to these claims, from, I don't know what you wanted to call it, but something like a certain certainty that we've got the metaphysical truth about everything. And that's something that I'm very suspicious about.
Well, you know, you said and I mentioned this to JP last time JP and I talked, that there is no final metaphysic.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And you know, we would say that as Christians. So metaphysics is a philosophy. It's a philosophical construction, right? We're always going to be reaching in our metaphysics, and the metaphysics are going to be changing. They always have been.
Yeah, that's
all right.
That's the history of Christianity itself shows that.
Right.
True.
But isn't the same thing true too of the science?
Of course.
Because you're okay. So I guess
I try to make that very clear. I make a very explicit case, and I devote an entire lecture to it, that I'm presenting a plausibility argument and lay out very clearly what that means, and that I'm not making a claim that the science has any final or complete answer on this. And that's why I took great pains to lay that out, because I wanted to be very clear about the status. Now, I don't think plausibility should be ignored. Plausibility precisely means it should be taken seriously. But it is not a claim to certainty. It is not a claim to finality. So, I clearly tried to articulate that and acknowledge that right from the beginning.
Okay, so when we're talking about the human, how would we put it? Quest, maybe, is a good description. Quest for wisdom.
Yeah.
All right. We don't want to ground it on a metaphysic without the recognition that our metaphysic is conditional, right?
Sure. I think so.
But don't we also face the same problem grounding it on the science?
I think we do, and like I said, I try to introduce something epistemologically analogous to the psychological category of indispensability. I was trying to introduce this other normative standard by which we can evaluate our claims from a scientific perspective. Let's call them the theoretical claims, because that way we can include both philosophical, metaphysical claims and scientific claims that have a metaphysical import to them, perhaps. And that's like in between, just opinion and certainty. I'm trying to argue that what we're actually working on, in fact, what science has to work on, what is epistemologically indispensable, is plausibility. Before what hypothesis are you going to consider? Well, not all logically possible ones, only ones that are plausible. Once you design your experiment, what confounds are you going to control for? Not all logically possible ones, only the plausible ones. Once you run your experiment, what interpretations are you going to derive from that? All logically possible ones? No, the plausible ones. What debates are you going to enter into? All possible ones? No, the plausible ones. I think plausibility is before, during, through, and after all of our best scientific enterprises. Now, I think there's, we have to take care about that. Plausibility, at least I argue, has a structure to it, and we have to respect that. But plausibility means precisely that. It doesn't mean certainty. It means that this is what you should take seriously. This is what you should base your decisions and your projects on. That's how I work as a scientist. My judgment as to what the most plausible hypotheses and theories are the ones I use. One of the frustrating things about being a scientist, it's happening to me right now. I'm working on a paper in Meaning in Life. You take this work, some of it's plausible, and then as you're writing the paper, somebody does an experiment, makes a theoretical debate, and one piece is undermined. That constantly happens to me. And so you're constantly in this process of trying to go from what's plausible, but always remembering that you're in a process that's inherently self-correcting in nature. So yeah, I would acknowledge that. Sorry, that might have been a speech, but I'm trying to lay out very carefully.
That's good. What I'm kind of wondering, because I think yeah, you'd have to be deaf, blind, and dumb not to think that we need wisdom, right?
Yes.
and not to look at the world situation and recognize that there's a definite gap between the wisdom we need and the wisdom we have.
Sure.
So that the desire to bridge that gap, I'm just wondering what would be what is the surest foundation? Because the metaphysics does change and gets updated. It seems to me that science changes and gets updated even more rapidly.
Sure. Yes.
Although I do recognize that for people today, science tends to have more authority than metaphysics. So it might be a good jumping off point. I'm just wondering how foundation it really, because I'll hear you say, we want to craft these psychotechnologies according to the best science.
Yes.
Right? But then how firm of a foundation do you see that having going forward? Like, okay, take your own work, which I think is great and brilliant. But I do know that, okay, like if you look back the past 300 years, you probably can count on the fingers of one hand the number of scientists who are still read, going back a century and then back, say, 300 years from that, who are still read with some sense that their contribution stands. Does that follow what I'm saying? Whereas I think metaphysically, we're still reading Augustine. We're still reading Plato. So I'm wondering if you judge the weight of what is the most firm foundation for this, I'm kind of wondering if science really has that firm foundation that we want going forward for Project for Human Wisdom. So what do you think about that?
Okay, that's great. I just want to make also, I'm going to respond to you, Mary, and I think that's a great question. I just want to make sure that JP isn't feeling excluded from the conversation right now.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just trust you to interject. We're all trying to be good friends here, and that's important to me. So I just want to respect that. So let me respond to that, Mary. First of all, I think the issue is what aspects of our ontology change, and at what pace do they change, and what are the primary ways in which they change. So I think our fundamental ontology is not something we can establish scientifically. It's something that ultimately is presupposed by our science. Now, I don't think that gives us an open license, because we sort of have rejected that for a long time, that we can just do metaphysics ignoring what our empirical investigations are saying. So even within current philosophy, for example, analytic philosophers do a lot of work in metaphysics, and the reason they can do that is because they're trying to get clear about a lot of the notions that are being presupposed by science. For example, the way I go about establishing plausibility, I can't run an experiment to establish plausibility for the very reason I just gave you. The very argument I gave you is the whole experimental setup presupposes plausibility. So what do? Well, I enter into a philosophical analysis. Now, philosophical analyses tend to change a lot slower. The pace of philosophy is a lot slower. And that's for good reason, because it's harder to both get a consensus in philosophy, and it's also harder to overturn a position in philosophy and show that it's sort of clearly wrong in some profound way. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's good that philosophy proceeds at a much slower pace than empirical investigations. So I think what I'm saying is that I'm not a foundationalist epistemologically to begin with, but I don't want to saddle you with that philosophical jargon necessarily. I think that what we need to do is, when I say make use of our best science, of course I'm saying make use of our best science set within a more comprehensive and consistent framework. That's why I often go between science and the broader framework of naturalism. Naturalism isn't, as many people rightly point out, and I never disagree with them, naturalism isn't a scientific theory. It is a metaphysical stance that is designed to be as consistent as possible with the practice and the presuppositions of science. Mm-hmm. So I would broaden my response and say that I think the best metaphysics we have right now are the ones that tend to be more consistent with our science. One of the things I've tried to do, and I understand that people might disagree. I've often tried to, oh my, this sounds very pretentious, but I've tried to update people like Plato and show, for example, how a lot of his work can be understood in terms of modern cognitive science. And that tends to make the work more, I think, both more powerful in its application and more accessible to people in general. So I don't know, do you I think maybe I'm taking too long to answer you, but what I'm trying to say, Mary, is that I don't see a choice. I see the science and the naturalistic metaphysics in which it sits as one continuous package, mm-hmm. and that the various layers are changing at different paces, as they should, because they operate according to different procedures and different normative standards.
Yeah, I very much agree. And it seems to me like it's precisely when we lose that interplay between science and metaphysics that things tend to go haywire, whether it be in metaphysics. There are lots of, especially Christian metaphysicians who still do metaphysics like Plato or Aristotle used to do it, and they have a very hard time connecting with people who are scientifically trained. And conversely, there are lots of people in the sciences who, because they have no contact with deeper philosophy, they sort of assume a naive materialism just offhand, because it's what's easiest to come to if you just look at your simple science.
Yeah.
So I really, instead of seeing it as foundations, I think it really has to inform. I think they always have to dance with one another. And in the same way that even when we were talking about, being certain of our metaphysics or of our science, in the same way that we shouldn't expect a set metaphysics and idolatrize it, we should not also pretend that metaphysics is better than science or vice versa. We should just always sort of play with them.
I'm glad we're in agreement with that. And I agree. I think that both a scientifically naive metaphysics and a scientism that denies the relationship between the philosophical relationship between science and its presupposed metaphysics is also, that's one of the problems I have with many people that seem to present a kind of scientistic attitude towards things. To be fair to me, I do try to present, right? And notice that the last episodes of the series are coming back to people of a more philosophical orientation. I try to make it very clear that I want to zoom in and out from the science. And I even divided the series up into a more philosophical, historical side and a scientific side. And then I tried to get them like in dialogue with each other all the way through. Yeah, that's what I would. I think I don't know if I have anything more to say. I'm totally open, Mary, if you have a follow-up or question you want to answer. But that's sort of my response.
I do have one because I know from what you've said, you work some with people who are working on AI, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is one of the would you say, from your engagement with those people, that generally they are more in the scientism frame of mind?
There's two groups. There's two groups, and I can answer this question accurately because of what I teach and where I work. So the group of people in AI that are interested in interested in cognitive science, they tend to be like what JP and I are agreeing on. They tend to see that you need to set the science within a philosophical framework, that you can't You can't do this without thinking about some of your fundamental metaphysical questions. Then there's another group of people that are sort of more, I don't want to tar anybody, so I'm trying not to be insulting. So I'm just trying to answer your question. There are people that are more sort of pure computer science orientation, and they tend to be more towards the scientific end of the spectrum. But if they bump into cognitive science, that sounds like meeting somebody in a dark alley. If they bump into cognitive science, that generally has the effect of changing them. So some of my best students, when I teach the introduction to cognitive science, are people who've come in from that computer science background and then go, oh, I see. So there's sort of two groups there. There's two groups. Both groups are working very strongly and making important contributions towards the project of artificial general intelligence.
Well, one of the things that I have had a question about has been, and I've listened to a number of lectures of people talking about AI. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed a certain thing that puzzles me, and I heard it also when you were talking about it. And it kind of goes like this. It's talking to the public generally and says, this is coming. Mm-hmm. We have to be ready for it. It's coming. Yes. And when I hear that language, it's not the language that I think belongs to something that is a matter of human decision. You know, if a hurricane is coming, I expect for people to say it's coming. Or if it's a tsunami or something like that.
That's an excellent point.
But when people say it's coming and we have to be ready for it, and then oftentimes this is followed by statements, and not that you've made these, but I'm sure you've heard them. You know, this is going to mean the elimination of X number of hundreds, thousands, millions jobs. This is going to mean this disruption, that disruption. Yeah. And I listen to that and I think, okay, here's what's not being said. What's not being said is some decisions are being made by these particular people who actually are human beings with names and faces, and their intention is to do this thing that is going to have this effect on the rest of you, and they don't seem to want to engage in any conversation with the rest of you about whether you want these things to happen.
That's very well said. That's very well said. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I was going to just say, now you come from a perspective where I've heard you so much, and you enact this, you embody this, you showing us all how to do it. The importance of dialogue and collective intelligence and all of that. In this field, I'm not getting the impression that there's a lot of thought about that. What I get the impression is that there's these people who are scientists and they're pretty much married to moneyed interests, and the rest of us be damned. So how would you address that?
Okay, so let me address the last point in a minute. I want to go back to the first point, because the first point I think was an excellent point. The point when I make a statement, it has a fatalistic tone to it that is inappropriate because people are taking me as an authority for whatever reason, hopefully because I presented some relevant expertise. And so, yes, human decision should be, it's not like the hurricane is coming. It's not a shall, it is a will. So I want to bring back the fact that we have that. So let me try and explain to you why, because I have entered into the dialogue that you've mentioned. I've talked about at the Center for Ethics, the need to put AI into discussion with, not just artificial intelligence. We need to talk about artificial rationality, artificial wisdom. I have that out there. So I do this. Why I think the implicit argument, which I should have made explicit to address, I think your very good criticism, is it's a historical argument. It's the argument that we have not done this, and you can see me, there's a place, Mary, where I actually do consider this argument, which is the talk I gave, the TEDx talk on neural enlightenment. Because the argument there is that typically in the past, we have a long track record of adopting these technologies way ahead of any good understanding of all of their side effects, of their social effects, of their impact on our sense of meaning, our sense of identity. And you know, so you think about, you know, the way we adopted, you know, nuclear options, the way we went into the Industrial Revolution. And so I want to add to that also the fact that this is not happening in one place. We do not have, you know, people are pursuing this in China and in Russia and in the United States and various parts of the world, and we can't get all of those people to cooperate in the pursuit. So given those two factors, the historical precedent and the fact that we have no way of policing people, I do think that we are going to do what we've always done and go ahead with this technology. Now, that brings up your second point, which, well, you know, isn't it just sort of moneyed interests that are doing this? Well, first of all, I don't want to deny that money has a huge impact, funding has a huge impact on science, but the people I know, some of the people that have made this possible, my students, or people like Jeff Hinton, I know these people. I know that their interest is not financial. They're like me. I mean, I'm not trying to. If I could do what I did and it would not have the implication of creating, you know, potentially autonomous robots, I would love that. Because I'm interested in understanding the mind, and a lot of these people are interested in understanding the mind. You see, and artificial intelligence gives us a new way of understanding the mind that we didn't have before. See, the problem with studying your intelligence, Mary, is, well, first of all, and I'm not disagreeing with this, the state and moral codes protect you. I can't intervene in I can't take out a piece of your frontal lobe and see what happens, right? Let's put Mary in a room for 10 years without light and see how her vision is affected. I'm not allowed to do any of that. And then secondly, I mean, you know, whenever I do experiments on you, you're always pleasing me or trying to deceive me in some ways, often unconsciously on your own part, right? And then secondly, your behavior is so complex and mediated by meaning. It's very hard to get, right, a picture of the mind. And what's interesting about AI is this new proposal. We can try and understand something by reverse engineering it, right? And because I make it, then I'll get a clear understanding. And up until now, this is where it may change, I've been able to do that without worrying about all those moral qualms, those legal issues, and machine, you know, that's self-interpreting and has an existential status. And so that has really helped move the study of the mind forward in a lot of ways. So I do know that there's a lot of people, I include myself and some of the people I've mentioned, and most of my students, they're not motivated by a desire to accrue a lot of money or bring about some titanic social changes. They're motivated by the deep scientific concern of understanding the mind. And as I've tried to argue in the meaning crisis, I think that has existential import. Unless we can understand the mind in a way that resituates it back into our worldview, I think we're still going to have the meaning crisis. I can clearly say that's one of my motives and the motives of a lot of my students.
I'd like to also add that it's a great story. Even, you know, money aside, it's a great story to think that we could create, you know, creatures that are more intelligent than us, that, you know, are more capable and so on, that we will create some sort of super creature. You know, it's not necessarily a happy story, but it is fascinating, and I can see it driving lots of people.
Well, there's concerns, and so, I mean, the thing that Mary's point brings out, which is there's decisions being made all along the way. For the reasons I've just articulated, I think this is going to happen because that's been so one of the things I've tried to do is to, and that's one of the things I did explicitly a while ago in that neural enlightenment talk. I said, well, look, we have an opportunity we haven't had before when we've blundered into our world-changing technologies, which is we have the opportunity to actually turn them on ourselves and perhaps help advance and train the wisdom to actually reflect upon and use these technologies wisely. So perhaps for once, we could try to couple the wisdom cultivation practices to the technological advancement. I'm not claiming that this is inevitable. I'm just saying, well, we have this. Let's decide to do it this way. And so that's what, like I said, and that's why I've been arguing for that. And also, to follow up on Mary's concern, this is why I've been continually arguing, not only in a talk I gave, but on podcasts, that we should not be just talking about artificial intelligence. Because if all we do is make very intelligent machines, just like us, I suspect, it's plausible to conclude that what we'll do is make machines that are very powerfully intelligent, and like our intelligence, they will be riddled with processes that are self-deceptive in nature. So we should be talking a lot more about artificial rationality and, dare I say it, artificial wisdom. And that, of course, means that we have to cultivate rationality and wisdom on our part, because we are the only models we have for these things. So that's how I'm trying to respond to your concern, Mary. I'm trying to bring, I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of where this is going to go for the reasons I've articulated. I think there's still decision points about whether or not we couple this process to trying to enhance our understanding of rationality and wisdom and the cultivation thereof, and to responding to the meaning crisis. So that is, in fact, one of the strongest motivators of my work, to try and get that coupled to wisdom and meaning. That's part of what I do, why I do what I do. Because I still think we have decision points there. Although my concern is that we might be running out of time on them as well.
So I have a question about the idea that studying the way that computers work helps you understand the way the human being works.
Sure.
So, I mean, I understand some of that, but I wonder if and I'm not claiming that you are in this state, but there surely are some who are enamored with the computer, and then coming back, looking at the computer and coming back to the human being with the computer language, so that we're talking about processes inside the human brain. We're saying things like processing information.
Sure.
You know, in other words, we're taking the language from the machine, and now we're applying it back to the human being. I don't know if you're familiar with the book. I think the author was Jeffrey Miller, was back in, I guess, the 70s or 80s, called The Body in Question. Are you familiar with that?
Jonathan Miller. I watched the series. Yes.
Jonathan Miller. Okay. Well, he talked about the way that every time we made something, we got a new metaphor for ourselves.
Yes.
Right? So, like, once we got good at making pumps, then the heart was a pump, you know. Yeah. And once we had transistor radios, then all of a sudden, you know, our mental faculties all had to do with electronics and stuff like that, right? So we're constantly doing this. As we invent things, it then becomes a metaphor for ourselves, right?
Sure.
And so we're doing that now, but if we're too enamored of the computer, and then the computer gets very much better at these things, that we're kind of become the frame that we're using to look at the human, that we will start to look at the computer, as JP said, as superior to ourselves. And then, you know, I'm just to kind of like make a biblical point about it. You know, in the Bible, there's a couple of places where the prophets mock the idols, right? And say, they have eyes and they cannot see. They have ears and they cannot hear. They have mouths and they cannot speak. And it's almost like we're saying, oh, well, that's okay. Now we'll build one that can see and can hear and can speak.
Sure.
And if that is going, you know, what will be the implications then for the way that we view our own humanity? And then another aspect of that is, with the size and scope of these things that seem to be coming upon us with their intrusiveness into every aspect of life, the amount of data they can collect, the amount of observation they're able to do of us, etc., that it seems that in many cases the human is being made the servant of this thing. Sure. Now, we used to serve the God who made us and worship the God who made us. If we become the servants of this thing that seems to be greater, what is to prevent us from then worshiping that God that we made? Like, can you see how all of these things are kind of...
Yeah. No, that's good. So let's take it step by step, because I think there were several good points, and I think they're linked in a rational manner. The first is I agree with that thesis that we make various artifacts and then we use them to understand the mind. The thing that has to, and of course we do this throughout all of science. We make metaphors, and then we use those metaphors to try and get our initial problem formulation. The issue is, do you get past the metaphor? Does the metaphor start to give you fruitful science? Do you start to uncover phenomena? Do you start to explain things that you couldn't explain before? And the thing, for example, about the computer revolution in psychology is it had this huge effect. I'm not going to even talk about specific discoveries that were made. I'm going to talk about a whole shift, because before we did that, before we made that move, we were in the grips of behaviorism. I mean, that was the dominant psychological view. And so the topic of meaning, the topic of consciousness, the topic even of mind was not allowed. And one of the things that happened with the shift of the cognitive revolution is that, as we saw that we could now talk in a mathematically rigorous way about information processing, this made possible the scientific and experimental investigation of meaning, and now consciousness. So that's one thing. So insofar as I think the metaphor moves beyond just a metaphor, the way it actually creates good science, opens up whole new areas of study, generates whole new empirically validated claims, makes us aware of things that we weren't aware before. I tried to argue in the show, like, if we didn't do the information processing stuff of Newell and Simon, we wouldn't really be aware of the combinatorial explosive nature of of the world, and the way our brain and mind have to process that. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. You should also know that the metaphor now is going both ways. So many computer models are being supplanted by neural network models, and neural network models are inspired by trying to create machines that mimic the sort of the structural functional organization of the brain. They're microprocessors, often done virtually, but sometimes it's done in actuality. Microprocessors that affect each other. In fact, most of the significant advances in machine learning have come out of neural networks that are patterned not on like a computer program, but are patterned on this dynamic self-organization of the brain. And by the way, all of that neural network work has made possible, to take seriously that whole aspects of our cognition are not language-based, because the neural networks aren't language-based processors. So the whole understanding and the ability to understand animal cognition, and you talk about relevance to chickens and stuff, is that's all afforded by this move. So I think that what's happened is we've moved beyond the metaphor, and that it's also going both ways now. And this is why for example, you'll often see me making use of biology as an important way of talking about the AI and understanding the AI, because if something like deep continuity is right, and I don't want to get into deep continuity and panpsychism right now, but if something like deep continuity is right, it's at least pragmatically, it's turned out to be very right, in the sense that by paying attention to biological principles, we actually get much deeper understanding of how cognition works. So I think there's ways in which we're beyond the metaphor, and that it's going both ways. It's much more like a dialogue now between the biology and the machinery.
Yeah, and even the metaphysics.
Yes, even the metaphysics. JP, if I could just respond to Mary's second point, then I'll give you a chance. Now, the next point is, I think I'm using this word correctly for you guys. The second point that Mary brought up, or maybe it was a third point, but anyways, the point I want to turn to now is there's a religious point here, which is we might be getting into a form of idolatry, and we might be putting ourselves into a form of servitude that is inappropriate to human dignity. And because I think one of the things I think the Bible is clear on, I'm sorry, speaking to Christians about the Bible, but that idolatry is not just an affront to God, it's an affront to human dignity as well. The affront goes both ways.
Right.
So there's agreement on that.
Yeah.
So not only might worshiping or being in servitude to the AI be blasphemous in some sense, it's clearly and unquestionably could be an affront to human dignity. I take all of that to be Mary's deeper point. And I think that's something that we have to talk a lot more about. Now, I would recommend, if our goal is to try and forestall that kind of negative outcome, I recommend we try to use a language that is comprehensive as possible. So if you were to go to people and present this as an affront to Christianity or something like that, I don't think it's going to be successful enough, because of there's a degree of urgency here, and I don't know if there's enough time. But I think if we could get a language, if we could bring, and that's what I'm trying to do, if we could get a language of sacredness that is comprehensive enough, and a language of meaning, and talk about this enough, and if we build that into how we want to build these machines, then maybe we can separate their intellectual power from any automatic and simplistic and incautious elevations of status. I predict it's going to go another way, but I think it also has the great potential to affront human dignity. I think we're going to cyborg. We're already playing with that. We're going to start integrating these machines directly, because we've been cyborgs for several species in human evolution, and look at us. Look at how cyborg we are right now. So I think that's definitely coming. I would hope that as we cyborg and as we make these machines, I predict that what's going to happen is they're going to be like us, in that they're going to be self-defining, self-interpreting, self-transcending machines. And I would hope that, like us, just because they have very great intelligence, this gives them no easy way to answer these profounder questions about self-interpretation, self-transcendence, because I don't think they're the kinds of questions that you can algorithmically move your way through. I think these are deeply existential philosophical questions. So I don't expect a Silicon Socrates in that sense, unless, again, it's because we've cyborged with them. So what I'm saying, Mary, is, well, I think we will definitely be tempted potentially to blasphemy, because people do worship their technology, and there might be a risk of us falling into a significant affront to human dignity. There is a way of structuring this and structuring these machines that, tells us that they will face issues of self-deception. They will face the needs for self-definition and self-transcendence. They will face the need for wisdom. And if they were actually significantly wiser than us and spiritually more profound than us, then maybe we should listen to them. I'm sorry, I don't want to end tritely. But
I think there's a funny quote by I think it's Augustine, not sure, who said that if pigs could somehow be aware of themselves, we should baptize them?
Yeah, and you know, I would hope that just like we also seriously consider the moral status of animals, I don't eat mammals for very good for that reason, that just that these machines, because they are, I'm trying to use a neutral term, existential machines and not just intelligent machines, that they would also remember our moral status and want to enter into not just intellectual relationships with us, but moral relationships and existential relationships. So I see this as a very real possibility. I'm not sure that just because they're more intelligent, they'll be able to solve like the mind-body problem or things like that, because again, I think these questions have an existential aspect to them. I do think, for example, Mary, that these machines, in order to have a lot of the autonomy and even the intelligence we have, they're going to have to be deeply embodied things, and people are understanding this, and they're going to have to be deeply social. The idea of social robotics is now coming to the fore, and so there's a lot of ways in which they're going to be like us, that I think might prevent them simply becoming sort of silicon idols and silicon monsters.
Well, having heard all that, perhaps you could understand why I might say that I think that human beings having the ontological status of being made in the image of God is probably a very good defensive posture for us to take.
I do think that's true. I mean, and one of the, I should have made that more explicit. I think Heidegger's idea that we are the beings whose being is in question, and that gives us a special access to ontological issues. I think that's, if you don't take this as an affront, I think that's a secular version of saying we are made in the image of God. We are the beings, we are the ontological beings because we are the beings whose beings are in question. Therefore, it is more than our nature. I don't know what to say, but it's our existential status that we are the beings who will pursue ontological questions, and the beings who will come into relationship to the ground of being itself. I mean, I think in that sense, Heidegger's view is a secular version of us being in the image of God. And I think that that project is not going to be taken away from us by the machines. I don't see how it could be. And in fact, I would go I'd go the other way. I suspect they will bump into the project too if they go the way we're saying. And that might be a really, really interesting question. You have to remember that we things like neural networks, we don't program them. We set them up so that they evolve into the kind of state that they're in.
We set them up so they do relevance realization.
Yes, and other things like that, so that they come to a place. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes you feel better or worse, Mary, but I do think that that question isn't going to be taken away from us, and I think we will always perpetually have that status, because I don't think it's completely independent from the fact that we're intelligent, but it's surely not just a factor of our intelligence that we are the beings whose being is in question. It's something about us being cultural, social, historical, temporally extended, narrative, right? That we're also capable of rationality, we're capable of insight, wisdom. And again, if the machines are going to take that status from us, I think they would have to be the kind of beings that would not want to take the status from us, because they would also come to have a deep respect for that status.
Well, I'm a little less sanguine about the idea, but
well, let's be very careful here. I'm not saying that AI is definitely going to go that way. I'm saying if we're trying to just get beyond making machines, and we're trying to make agents that are rational and sapiential and not just intelligent, then that's where I'm making the prediction on the basis of.
Right. I understand. I Okay, so when I said this comment about being made in the image of God, all right, let me pivot to something else, because in the comments under one of your videos a while back, somebody asked the question about your project, and they asked, so what about the bozos at the bus stop? Do you remember that? Okay, this is fine, John. This is all very intellectual. What about the bozos at the bus stop? And I responded back and I said, well, in order for John to help the bozos at the bus stop, he would have to become one of the bozos at the bus stop and lead them all into transformation, and then establish a religious order that ministered to the bozos, a non-religious order that ministered to the bozos at the bus stop.
Yeah.
So
no, I thought.
So of course I'm teasing you a little bit on that.
That's fine. You're allowed to, Mary. I welcome it. I welcome it.
But it gets to that question of, in terms of your project, many people have made the comment that it has an element about it that's so intellectually demanding that it will tend towards an elitism.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. And Paul's made a very convergent argument with that, the argument about, he phrases it, scalability. And both I don't know what status to attach to bozos, but let's call it sort of intellectual scalability, but also developmental scalability. And you no doubt know that many times I've commented on, I think that's a very important point. I've explicitly done that. And so once again, I want to acknowledge, I think that's an important point. So part of it is, right, that there's a sense of, okay, so I don't want this first point to be taken as a dodge, because I'm not intending it that way. But there's a sense in which, the stuff that's intellectual percolates. I mean, Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz weren't worried about the bozos at the bus stop, but that stuff percolates now and their lives are affected by it. Or let's take something that's even more apparent. Freud. Everybody uses the language of Freud. Right. Everybody talks about unconscious and drives and all this because it is so percolated and becomes so pervasive. And so powerful ideas do have an ability to, if you'll allow me this without making them sound too agentic, but they do have the ability to scale themselves to a significant degree. And so that's one thing. The second thing is I completely acknowledge that there needs to be a kind of work that needs to be done, which the established religions have. So the established religions rely on a lot of non-intellectual media in order to do this. They rely on artistry and narrative and drama and performance and modeling. And I do think that that's going to be needed too. I'm working with Daniel Craig right now and a bunch of people to try and, see how could we bring in artists and performers and other people into this project so that the project becomes accessible and scalable in that way, so that people have many points of contact and ways of relating to it that can be sufficient to them for a certain scale at which they want to live their life, but also could afford them access to pursuing things more deeply. So one of the examples I use for this is the historical example of Stoicism, because Stoicism, of course, reached to the highest echelons of the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius becomes. But Stoicism was also able to reach to the lower thresholds. Epictetus was a slave. And so, and in fact, his writings have a huge influence on Marcus Aurelius. And because the Stoics, and we're just now trying to work this out, had a whole bunch of practices that were other than just intellectual practices. I gave a talk on the practice of the view from above at Silicon X about this. You might want to take a look at it. But there's all kinds of practices that people engage in that allow people, because for the Stoics, it was much more important that you lived a certain way than you could actually discourse a certain way. And so we've been able to do something like this before in the past. And so my hope is by trying to get people who have those skills, because I don't have those skills and I don't have that job, and I don't want that job in the sense that I'm not trying to found a religion. I really object strongly when people sort of accuse me of that. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explicate things that are already happening, and right, that we've got this confluence of 4E cog sci, these new psychotechnologies like circling, new communities of practices, new forums like this and Rebel Wisdom, and try to explicate what's going on there. And can we coordinate it to address what I think is a shared concern behind a lot of this, which is the meaning crisis? That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, I look at what, Carl Jung said, that his program was for people who were not already contained within a religion.
Yes.
So I look at what you're trying to do as attempting to find something that will help the people who are not contained within.
That's an excellent comparison.
And because and like I said in my video about how you tried to destroy religion, I said I didn't see that. What I saw you was trying to help the people who for some reason did not have access to that. Yes. I don't think the religions are going anywhere. And okay, because you asked, I thought the question that you asked about the phenomenological experience of the religions,
yes,
like the greatest question, because it to me, that's where the dialogues will come.
I agree. Right? I agree, and I would hope they would come that way. I should expect it because I'm a person who's talked about perspectival and participatory knowing, and so this is definitely I think something that we should be talking about at least.
Okay, so let me tell you a personal experience that I had, and what I want to lay out is like a problem that I had or that I encountered inside of myself. Mm-hmm. And what I want to do is give you the problem and then ask you in the framework of the practices that you are familiar with and that you are training people in or promoting, mm-hmm. how it would address that. And then I'll tell you how it happened that I did address it.
Okay, that's excellent. I like this proposal a lot, Mary.
Okay, so this was just it's less than a month ago, but I was watching something on television and it had some pictures of some refugee children in the Middle East. Okay, mm-hmm. And it was about some program to help some child refugees. And I was looking at it, and as I was looking at it, I found that there was this odd little hard place in my heart, which is strange for me. I mean, I'm a grandmother. I have 9 grandkids. I'm not immune to the cuteness and the vulnerability of children. But I found there was this little hard place, this little stone in my heart. And when I interrogated it, it came with a thought, which was kind of like, well, these are Muslim children, and yes, they might be very cute little kids, and they might be in all kinds of trouble now, but 25 years from now, they may be trying to kill your grandkids. Yeah. And I thought, that's quite the snaky little thought, Yeah. And so when I had that thought, before I tell you how I handled it, if I came to you and I said, here's my situation, I have this thought, and I do not want to be the person with this hardness in my heart, and I do not want to be believing this thought, or I do not want to be taking my stance toward my fellow human beings based on a thought like that. Mm-hmm. offer me as a practice or as a
Okay.
way to overcome that?
So first of all, I mean, I'd have to ask you some more questions because there's situations where, I mean, where that is very intense. So there are people that get very intrusive thoughts on a regular basis, and they could be sort of OCD or various things like that, and they need specific kinds of therapeutic intervention.
I'm not one of those people.
Okay, so let's say this is more. This is not sort of driven by any kind of pathology. Nevertheless, what I would say is, well, we should pay attention to some of the techniques that work in the more pressing case, because there's good reason to believe they might be also efficacious in a less pressing case. And so I would talk about the kinds of techniques that are used within a therapeutic setting to make us aware of I hope this doesn't seem tiresome to you, but the way in which we're self-deceptive, the way in which our cognition is biased, the way in which we leap to conclusions, the way we are easily capable of my side bias, which sounds to me like an instance of, my side and my group were right, and the anchoring bias is what I'm familiar with, and therefore it should be defended without question. So there's lots of practices you can do. So one practice that I've talked about is active open-mindedness. I do this myself. I start every day by reading about a particular bias, and then I try to look throughout the day, and then at the end of the day, I journal about it, try to note where I noticed it, try to see evidence where I might not have noticed it in terms of how things turned out. And what happens is you train yourself over time to become aware of these biases, and then you can actively counteract them as you become more and more sensitive to them, and as you become aware of them earlier and on in your processing. So, for example, today, I noticed as I was reflecting on something that I was doing the confirmation bias. I was only looking for information that confirmed my belief. Because I was sensitive to it, and I've been practicing mindfulness, I could step back and say, okay, now what I'm going to do is specifically direct myself to look for some disconfirming evidence. You can do the same, and to bring it to something that's more existentially similar to what you talk about. The past few days, I've been doing, I do these like in cycles, right, kind of thing. I've been noticing, the tendencies towards narcissism and egocentrism, and then trying to step back and actively counteract them. And what happens over time, and this is, this is something held by the Buddhist traditions and the Taoist tradition and the Stoic traditions, is you get that change. You get that change in which that tendency is ameliorated. I would never claim any kind of perfectionism. I think the proper adjective for that is ridiculous. But have I seen in my own life amelioration of a hard-heartedness? Yes. Have other people, independently of me talking about this, reported that in their observations of me? Yes. And do we have scientific experimental evidence that these techniques are efficacious? Yeah. And so that helps a lot. I mean, other things I do that help, when you're meditating, you're triggering the insula and you get it more active. And the insula is not only how you intercept your own body, it's how you pick up on other people's mental states. So if you intercept them more, if you do the meditation and you enhance your insula, you'll enhance your ability to pick up on other people's mental states. And so that also helps, because it's harder to dismiss somebody in a categorical fashion when you can pick up on their internal life. So those are some of the things I would recommend. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, I was wondering what kind of like set of practices there would be for someone dealing with that. Now I'll tell you what I did.
Sure.
So when I saw this in my heart, I recognized it because I'm coming from a Christian perspective. Okay?
Of course, Mary.
So I recognized it as a sin.
Sure.
All right. And so I took my stand on a promise in the Bible where God says that a humble and contrite heart he will not spurn. So I said, I'm sorry. I recognize that I have this hardness in my heart and that it's wrong. And then I also mentioned to God that he had promised that he would remove hearts of stone and give us a heart of flesh. It's another promise in the Bible. And I said, I don't know how to get this stone out of my heart, but you do. And so I turned it over to him, and I also made the mental resolution that the next time I go to confession that I would confess it. And then I left it. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't try to enter into conversation or argument with it because I really didn't even know how. A few days later, I think it may have been as soon as within the next 48 hours, I happened to be looking in on YouTube, and there was a YouTube video about Muslims having dreams of Jesus. And a phenomenon that I had no idea that it was going on, but it was that there's this phenomenon all throughout the Middle East in a number of countries of many, many thousands of Muslims having a dream of Jesus appearing to them and saying he loves them. And I'm not saying that they instantly, convert or anything like that. In some cases, when they have the dream, they also have a dream of Jesus accompanied by a person. And he'll say, this is a friend of mine. And then the Muslim will be walking on the street and they'll see this Christian person and say, you were in my dream. And they'll tell the person about the dream. And it's such a prevalent phenomenon that in one of the countries, I think it might be Egypt, a Christian ministry just put up a billboard and said, have you had a dream of the man in white? We can answer your questions. It's happening that much. And I read that. I mean, I listened to that video about that. And what was really pertinent to me about, or relevant, was that Jesus was saying to them he loved them while they were Muslim. It wasn't like Jesus was saying, convert and become a Christian and I'll love you, And that just hearing the few testimonies and then, knowing that is going on, that completely changed my heart. I mean, that removed that hardness in my heart completely. This is because you asked about what are we phenomenologically experiencing that kind of warrants the ontological sense that we're dealing with a person, with a personal being at the ground of being. And I would say it's that kind of experience. Now,
so let's go carefully then on what that means, okay? Because I want to understand what. So I mean, for example, I didn't talk about it, but I could have, but because you've heard me allude to it, I also take the perspective of what would Socrates do, or what would Marcus Aurelius, or try to do that. And internalizing the sage, as I argue in the series, is a pervasive practice that you do in order to. And there's work by Igor Grossman showing that if you do that sort of third-person perspective on your problems, it will trigger an insight. And insights are not things we do; they're things that we undergo, right?
Yeah, they happen to us, right?
We can afford them. We can afford them. They're not random. We can alter the probabilities of their occurrence, like practice mindfulness, practice the view from above, practice taking the third person perspective. But there's definitely an aspect in which it self-organizes and has a life of its own. So is the part of the phenomenology that goes beyond that the sense that you're being spoken to? I'm trying to get the phenomenology. Because
no, I didn't have a sense that I was being spoken to. What it was is, I don't know if if I would necessarily have even noticed or clicked on that video if I hadn't already like made that prayer and been made aware of the need to use your language to transcend myself in that area, right?
Sure.
So I can see a lot of what you're saying about relevance, you know, finding something salient,
yep,
you know, in that event. But I didn't cause the Muslims to have the dreams.
Okay, well,
you know?
So there's two aspects to that. Let me respond to the first. The fact that I know I'm going to be writing for my journal at the end of the day makes me sensitize and notice things I wouldn't notice. In a similar way, I think that to your prayer. Again, I don't mean any disrespect, but I'm trying to say in that same way that your prayer primed you, right? And so you have the insight. Knowing that, so I'll be walking along and I'll have the insight and go, and it's because I know I'm going to be writing at the end of the day in my journal, and that has that effect. So I think I have something very analogous to that. Now the other point about the event, that comes down, I guess, to an area I don't know what we'll be able to talk about it very much. I'd like to. And I'll be as open as honest I can about it, and I know you will too. I mean, that's where perhaps you see the miraculous, and I see sort of cultural things happening, and the fact that, you know, I mean, you could give one example. I'm not claiming this is the right example. I'm just using it as an example. You know, Jung talked about how, you know, he was having all of these dreams of blood drenching the earth before the war, and you know, and the Muslim world is in a kind of contest with Christianity, and perhaps those dreams are again, you know, trying to portend a needed shift in cultural cognition about the relationship between Islam and Christianity. I'm not claiming that's the case. You accept that. I'm claiming that that's an explanation. And of course, I could see. I'm quite happy with that kind of explanation. I'd say, oh yeah, that makes good sense to me. And you know, I see. I understand why Jung had the dreams he had. I understand that. And for me. Pardon me. Do I what?
Sorry, you can finish your sentence, and I'll
I was just going to say, for me, the fact that if we take it that a large part of our adaptive cognition, and I argue for this very explicitly, is pre-egoic and it's self-organizing, and that what we can do is sort of activate it and trigger it, and I think that's kind of what Jung was talking about. That's not completely unfair, right? Because Jung's model of the the psyche is a self-organizing dynamical system, and many people have commented on that, right? I see that, you know, there's whole aspects of self-organization that are going on and trying to inform and constrain my conscious awareness, and I see that on a continuum with what I'm doing with my journal, right? It's activating self-organizing processes that are shaping, putting constraints on my salient landscape, so I notice things that I've been blind to in the past, and so that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, here we're kind of making the thing is, I suspect, is that in our Western metaphysics, there is a large gap between, let's say, the cultural explanation, which you just gave, John, and then there's a large gap to the miraculous explanation.
Right, and I'm not using that term dismissively. Mary understands that, I hope.
Oh, I understand, yeah.
But I mean, I agree that at least in Western metaphysics, the gap is fairly clear, that you need to, that there are clearly jumps there to say that, okay, the cultural explanation is insufficient. But this is tentative, but I think that the sorts of metaphysics which you can see, especially in Eastern Christianity, and which Jonathan talks about a lot in his channel, seems to really collapse the two, where there is a clearer hierarchy of beings, and let's say the fact that the ground of being could manifest itself through, let's say, the cultural layer would not Yeah, the fact that God would manifest itself at the cultural layer, let's say in the dreams of multiple people, would not take away the causality of the ground of being from doing this. You see where I'm trying to get at?
I do. I mean, and you and I have talked about this, and I talked about it recently with Jonathan.
Yep.
And that's why I was mentioning Erigena about trying to get beyond either a metaphysics of emergence or a metaphysics of emanation. And that's where I also talked about, I tried to give a steelman version of the argument that you and Mary had made.
Thank you for that, by the way.
Well, of course, you guys are doing good work. You should only be treated with respect. I mean, that's how it should be. We're all fallible. I know I'm making mistakes, so let's just keep working together. I mean, we criticize each other. We're disagreeing right now, but we're doing it in a way that's helpful. I guess the issue is, and you presented this to me, and so I'll just bring it back up in case people haven't seen that discussion. You presented that we're going to get down to some fundamental presuppositions, and then it becomes not so much a question of epistemic decidability; it becomes more a question of existential risk.
Yeah.
So I'm not taking as much existential risk. I mean, there's other ways in which I take more risks than you do, and some people have commented on that, but I understand what you were trying to convey. Because you're positing a commitment to entities I'm not positing, if you'll allow me that. I'm trying to speak as neutrally as possible. And therefore, that's riskier for you. But you think it's kind of and I don't mean this dismissively, it's kind of an extension of Pascal's wager. It's a greater risk, but it also has a chance for sort of greater, and I don't mean hereafter rewards, it has a chance for greater, you argued, existential rewards
right now. Yeah.
Right now. And I don't have any like way of like denying that. I mean, because of what I've committed myself to in this dialogue, that our metaphysics are self-correcting, and I've stated this clearly and explicitly, and I know I'm not sure people quite get it. I clearly do not have an argument that forecloses on the possibility of Christianity being able to reformulate itself in a way that addresses the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
I've explicitly said that I do not have such an argument, and I would deeply suspect anybody who claims to have such an argument. That's why I don't like some of the claims of the new atheists. What I do claim is, there's overwhelming evidence that many people, because if we shift off of epistemic to existential, then this becomes relevant, right, JP? Yep. Many people do not find that a viable alternative for them. We're not talking epistemically now, we're talking about the kinds of existential risks, because existential risks are not just an epistemic concern. They have to do with how you've been traumatized, what kind of courage you have, what's your character. All that kind of stuff comes into play now when we're talking about existential factors. And for many, many people, the empirical evidence is clear. They establish religions and that the miraculous interpretation are not viable to them. So that's my response. Yeah. My response is, I can't foreclose. I do not claim to foreclose. It's possible that Jonathan and Paul and you and Mary will succeed, and you will reformulate Christianity in a way that makes it much more efficacious for dealing with the meaning crisis. I also acknowledge repeatedly that people can return to Christianity and find meaning within that. I've always acknowledged that as well. But I'm saying that if we say that this final decision is one of existential risk rather than epistemic argument, then it becomes the fact that for many, if we move to existential risk, for many people, it's not viable for them. It's not viable.
Yeah, and
how much of that existential risk that exists is a result of Protestantism versus being a result of apostolic, include the Catholic and Orthodox altogether, the apostolic Christianity, with an acknowledgement that that as a Catholic, I am, there are people in my parish coming into the church right now. There is someone on the Discord server that Paul set up that's becoming interested in Catholicism and coming into the church right now. And I'm like, I look at that and my mind is blown. because with the current condition of the church and the hierarchy and the corruption that is so obvious to anybody with two eyeballs, it's incredible to me that these people are open-minded enough to look at the church and not have those things blind them to what's there. I know because I'm in it, but I mean, if I was outside right now, I don't know that I would be dipping my toe in that water. So, so having said all that, though, I do wonder how much of this looking at Christianity as not viable is really a result of the kind of truncated Christianity that we have in the West in Protestantism.
Not only truncated, but deeply fragmented. Right?
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. And I'd like to say that John really helps with that. You really help with that, I think, in your project. You know, there are all kinds of issues as Mary is raising, and for a long time, people were just leaving the church like crazy. And I think that the presence of people like you or Jordan Peterson as well, of people who are trying to come in discussion with Christianity from a secular approach, people who can talk the scientific language, really allows Christians to clarify on some points, to maybe give away some stuff, to gain some of the stuff, to reformulate better some of their positions. And we can see it just in this corner of the internet of how many people are coming back to church because of this joint discussion. And I can see it really in the discussions we've been having, John. I can tell you that this has really sharpened my metaphysics quite a lot, and much quicker than if you hadn't been there. There's really a good opponent processing that is going on between, say, the naturalism which you're putting forth, and I see it as more and more viable, and at the same time I see it as strengthening my Christianity really conjointly. And I hope that you're also getting something out of our discussions.
Totally. I was not being disingenuous when I was asking that question that you guys are trying to answer to me. And I hope I'm not seeming obstinate. I'm trying to be responsive and open to what you're saying to me. No, I definitely want to understand. This is not, Mary is right. I don't have a secret agenda. I'm not going to, like that's not going on here.
I don't want to, imply some suspicion. I'm just sort of flabbergasted that this is happening. That initially, before our first discussion, I was really expecting almost I was expecting some sort of reductive physicalism, or maybe, I was expecting that your position would fall prey to the typical objections put forward by, let's say, Chalmers or all the anti-physicalist arguments. I was totally expecting this. And as I've had discussions with you, and as you've talked with Jonathan, it turned out that your position, your naturalism, is quite close to the sort of Eastern metaphysics which Jonathan is talking about. So that's been a real surprise. And at the same time as this branch of metaphysics has taken form in this corner of the internet, it has strengthened the Christian side as well. So I'm just deeply amazed that this is happening. And as Mary is saying, that people are coming to church, and I talk to people who are very interested in Christianity today, and I'm just very thankful for you guys. I guess that's my rant.
Well, no, that's good. I should let you know that I get the same kind of feedback from Buddhists and Muslims as well, and even Taoists. Although there's not as many of those, so it's not as frequent. But you might have seen on my channel, I talked to Hamza Tzortzis a couple of weeks ago. He's a Muslim philosopher. And the response there was also very, very, very powerful. I take that to be important. It's always been something that I would regularly, when I started this argument in Buddhism, cognitive science, I would regularly ask the people who were committed to a particular religious tradition what their response was. And I was very open. Like, were you insulted? Were you offended? Were you dismissive? And of course, there were some people that were, no, I didn't. But overwhelming majority were no, I found this very valuable. I found this very valuable, very useful. And that's, again, that is good. I think I have said before, I'm not, I'm trying to get we all have to work together. And I'm trying to afford a synoptic integration for addressing the meaning crisis, and we have to work together to address the meta crisis. And we don't have a lot of time, and so that's uppermost in my mind. So
I want to bring this question back, John. Is when you say that you like you have a question in your mind, like you say, I'm not sure how Christianity could reformulate, and you'll whatever this, the reformulation to address this meaning crisis. When you say that Christianity, I'm wondering, are you really just talking about Protestantism? Because it seems
no, I don't know. No, Mary, I could answer that very clearly and directly. I'm talking about the dialogue I see within Christianity. That's why I brought up the fragmentation. I see the dialogue between you and Paul and Jonathan as exemplary. That you come in and you're not trying to convert each other. I don't know if that's the right word within Christianity, but you're not trying to get people to, no, you should become Eastern Orthodox. No, you should be Catholic. No, you should be Protestant. I don't see that happening. In fact, what I see is Christianity, to the degree to which you guys are representative, and that I don't know how representative you are, but what I see in our corner of the internet, right, is I see Christianity more broadly, right, trying to get something that's shareable between and across all of these divides that goes to a deeper kind of efficaciousness. So I see people, I see you, I see Paul, I see Jonathan, and if I'm unfair to you, please say, but I see that you, instead of I'm just committed to this doctrine, I see you as saying, no, we got to solve these problems, and this is how I think Christianity can address. I mean, that's how you're presenting, I think, in fairness to me, your series. You're presenting Ratzinger as coming in as, addressing this problem of the meaning crisis. And one of the reasons why I recommended your argument is precisely because of that shift. You're not just coming in and here's the doctrine, and here it is again, and here's how we're better than the Protestants, and here's how we're better than the Eastern Orthodoxies. No. Here's this meaning crisis, and here's how you can now reinterpret Christianity as a way of addressing the meaning crisis. That's why I commented on that one video you gave about, oh, look, here's a deep Christian response to the meaning crisis. I explicitly put that comment in because I see that that's the kind of reformulation I'm talking about. That's what I'm trying to address.
Okay.
Would you say that if... thank you. I don't have access to as much data as you do, John, but even still, it may be an impossible question to answer. But I'm still curious as to, there are distinct branches, and instead of trying to look for, let's say, convergence to one position, do you see sort of a convergence of several positions which are maybe coming closer together, but still remaining different, and just always working in opponent processing? And sort of,
I see a dynamical system forming. Yeah. And that's why I was talking about, and I think Jonathan and I've got to talk about that. So that's why I was talking about, instead of trying to get a hierarchy in which everybody's organized around, you get a small world network system that affords this self-organizing dynamical system, and no one thing is the boss, right? They're constantly shifting around. He didn't like that, but I think when I get to explain it to him, maybe when he watches this, he'll understand better what I was trying to articulate, because that's how the brain is organized. We kept looking for the boss in the brain, and there is no boss in the brain. Brain is organized as a constantly redesigning, constantly shifting small world network.
I think this could fit well with Jonathan's vision of Christianity, of different actors playing out a story. And Jonathan talks about it all the time in terms of, you have a center. In the center, of course, there is Christ, but as you get further away, there are other agents, and as you get further and further, eventually you encounter monsters, and even they have a place, and it's in the relationship of all of that the world holds together. So I think
I think small world networks and dynamical systems is a more accurate way of talking about them functionality than standard sort of hierarchical models. And that's why I was criticizing the way I did, because I didn't think they were representing what I see taking shape both outside of Christianity and within Christianity, as people are trying to tap into collective intelligence and tap into self-organizing processes and try to come up with responses to the meaning crisis. That's what I was saying. I'm neither an eclectic, and Jonathan and I are going to talk about this some more. I'm neither advocating eclecticism nor perennialism. I think it's something like what you see, like as you were describing it, JP. The system converges here, there's compression, and then it varies back out, and then it converges over here, and then it varies back out, and then it converges here, and then back to, and so you get something like deep learning in the process, rather than this kind of up-down hierarchical thing.
Oh, go on. Don't let me finish that sentence.
Well, no, I think that's all I had to say. I mean, I'm inspired by the fact I'm studying with Dan Chiappi how the scientists manage the rovers on Mars, and this is how they organize that work group. They organize it as a constantly shifting dynamical system that has a small world network, and they always converge on consensus, then they go out, they vary, and then they converge. And so it has this deep learning, and that's what I was talking about when I was talking with Jordan Hall about trying to get a deep learning functionality rather than just a hierarchical functionality.
Well, here's something that you might find intriguing. So a number of years ago, it occurred to me in the Bible, there's this odd thing that happens in the Old Testament where it seems like God is constantly doing this thing where he'll have this one individual and then he'll disperse that individual's identity through a group. And then he'll gather it back again and he'll call the group by that individual's name.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that, Mary.
And it goes, it happens over and over and over again, right?
That's very good.
So then when you did the lecture on opponent processing, I started thinking about the Old Testament, and I started thinking about all these verbs in the Old Testament of the scattering, the gathering, the casting down, the building up, the back, all this back and forth. And even when you make those gestures, and I thought, boy, it would be so interesting for somebody to do a study of the Old Testament through the lens of all these different opponent processing. I even wrote down like your opponent processes because I was thinking, let's see, where did I put them here? Like intrinsic, no, that's not it. I mean, you had a bunch of them. I thought I had, here they are. General versus particular, exploratory versus exploitative, resilience versus efficiency, compression versus integration versus accommodation.
Yeah.
All those.
So yeah.
And I thought, those are all, it may be that in the course of people reading the Old Testament, that maybe it was doing something to their brain as they read all these verbs.
I think that's really, really astute, Mary. I think there's a lot of that going on. I think it happens in other texts, but I think very much, this is part of what I try to get at, where I say we need to be paying attention to the processing and not just the propositions. It's very much a matter of manner and the way that's being internalized in cognition. That I think what you just said is really, really astute. I suspect that, and a lot of texts work this way. You can see the Neoplatonic tradition tried to arrange the order in which you should read the dialogues. Because the order of the Platonic dialogues, they thought would take you through this kind of transformative process, because it wasn't just the content of the dialogue, it's the manner and the perspectives they put you in and all that kind of stuff. So I just agree. I think it's plausible to me, at least prima facie, that that these, and I use this word non-pejoratively, the mythos is doing this powerful work, almost, not completely, but almost independent of the particular content of the story. It's rather these processing moves that are having a huge impact, a huge pedagogical and transformative impact on people. I think that's really good. That to me is important because it brings an alternative to even like a Jungian interpretation of the Old Testament, like you see Jordan Peterson doing. This is like, no, instead of, again, because that's still sort of content driven, trying to unpack the meaning of the content. And I'm not saying stopping doing that, but you're missing all, as I think you just pointed out, the ways in which there's all kinds of processing issues that are permeating to, I think, more profound and primordial levels of our cognition. I mean, I take that to mean, because I really deepen this, but I take that to mean when Pascal said, you know, his argument wouldn't make you believe, it would make you go to church and light a candle. And then it was the lighting of the candle and doing and hearing the story. Like you immersed in these things and they work procedurally on you. And yeah, I just agree, Marianne. I just wanted to say, I think that's really, really astute. I think it's brilliant. I think trying to interpret mythos that way, in addition to trying to just unpack the propositional content, I think that's an important thing that should be done more of.
Mm-hmm. And you're serious. Go ahead, Mary.
I was gonna say, it's in the Republic too. Like as the dialogues are going on, they walk up and down certain. They go up.
Yeah. Drew Hyland is excellent about that. About how, and I tried to talk, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the next series after Socrates. How when we sort of extracted the arguments from all this dramatic context, right, and all the characters that are speaking the arguments, when we removed characterization, when we removed drama, when we removed the narrative, and when we also removed the relationship between the dialogues, and we just extracted the arguments, we basically lost about 90% of what Plato's trying to do.
Right. And Persig's
Drew Hyland is excellent on that.
Yeah, then Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance does the same thing with the landscape that they're driving.
Yeah, very much. And Sevilla and I talked about that a bit, about how you can see how he's doing this. That's why I think, and I meant this seriously, that's why I think it's a sacred text for her. The way she reads it and the way she's engaging it and internalizing it and the way it's transforming her through all these scales and through all these different media, I think, and the way she keeps returning to it after transformation and it discloses more to her, I think it's very much having that role for her.
JP, what were you going to say?
Oh yeah, I was going to say that we can also see this every time we go to church, and it becomes especially salient after being in contact with your work, John, where we can see, okay, like every time we go to mass, then we gather together, we do things together, we sing, for instance, and then
we do things in synchrony.
Yeah, in synchrony. And there are moments where we literally say that we are united. Let's say when we start before communion, that we lift up our hearts, we sort of try to become one, and then we will enter in procession. We'll literally all go into line into the same place, and so we really act it out. And
it's an active symbolism. It's not just linguistic symbolism. Yeah. That's what I talk about. It's interesting because when I'm engaging in the circling practice with people are coming into this in a very secular framework. Nevertheless, because they're doing all this kind of stuff, they're doing all this deeply procedural and perspectival and participatory stuff, they will often, and I've commented on this before, they will often fall into, we talked about this, they will often fall into religious and spiritual language trying to describe their experience. Yes, very much. So I think the manner of mythos is just as important as the matter of mythos.
Okay.
I should get going soon, guys. I'm not trying to dodge anything, and I'd like to do this again. And I'd like to, perhaps after I talk to Jonathan again, I'd like to get you guys' feedback on, because Jonathan and I came to not convergence, but we came to an approach where I was acknowledging the steel man version of a response you could make, JP, and you were helping him make it, Mary. The idea that there's something analogous in how possibility collapses to actuality, that's analogous to how relevance realization sifts through all the possibilities and picks out the salient. Yeah. And so that there's an aspect of deep conformity between the machinery of our cognition, not the content, but the machinery of our cognition. And if you'll allow me this as a metaphor, the machinery of being in the real relationship between real possibility and real actuality. Yeah. And so I thought that, I think that's an interesting idea I'd like to talk to you about.
Yeah. I think maybe getting your feedback on where to go from there could be useful, because I suspect that
Oh, sure. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead. So what's your suspicion?
Yeah, I suspect that once we have that same idea about the ground of being, the question will be, in doing relevance realization, how does this ground of being manifest itself? And if yeah, before talking about your position, I suspect that, for instance, a reductive physicalist would say that, well, the ground of being manifests itself in turning possibility, let's say, into fundamental particles, and then he would say that the whole world sort of is built up on top of those fundamental particles.
Yeah, but he can't do that consistently, because that's to pretend that physics doesn't have its fundamental problem, which is it can't integrate the top-down cosmology of relativity with the bottom-up emergence of quantum, right? And so that's just not playing fair.
So it seems to me like what your naturalism will assert regarding to the manifestations of the ground of being will go much higher than just the level of the fundamental particles. Let's say that if let's say there are some relations which hold at the level of a society, then it means that the ground of being, in sustaining that pattern at the level of society, is manifesting itself in that society.
I think so. Jerry Fodor, foundational computational cognitive scientist and self-declared atheist, nevertheless argued that in order to really explain things, we'd have to supplement Darwin's ideas of natural selection with something like what he said. We have to invoke the ancient notion of the law of forms, that there are certain forms, right, certain patterns that seems to be constitutive of reality, certainly constitutive of our ability to do science on reality, that, right, we need, like I said to you and what I said with Jonathan, we need to somehow, Whitehead's idea that possibility has to be organized so that we get these forms, these particular patterns, these particular real patterns are the real patterns. Because we easily, this is part of why we fall into illusion, we conceive of all kinds of patterns that aren't real patterns. Well, out of all of the possible patterns, why are these the real patterns? So I would take it not just emergence at the level of the fundamental particles, but all the laws of form, all the laws, period, that also have to exist. And some of them are laws that work like relativity at a cosmological scale, right? And at scopes of much beyond us, like at the speed of light and things like that.
And even when, let's say, two people are in relation with one another, there are complex relations that occur not only within the individuals, but in the communion of those individuals. Right. And the ground of being is involved in sustaining those relations as well.
I want an account of possibilities organization that tells me why self-organizing dynamical systems exist. And why things don't just stay sort of chaotically disorganized. I mean, and notice that this is a real problem for physics, because physics needs to explain where all the difference came from, because everything starts from an absolute singularity, and where the difference comes from is actually, I think, just a fundamentally important question.
So having said all that.
Go ahead.
Having said all that, I suspect that the question then on how do we move on from this to asserting Christianity would be, I think we would need to, let's say, carry out a very careful analysis of all of those patterns and see how well they fit with Christianity. So it becomes almost a more tractable symbolic problem. If you see where I'm going, let's say
I think there's an intermediate step though. Okay. And that's where the disagreement still lay between Jonathan and I, and perhaps between myself and you two, is I was willing to concede the analogy, but then I have the other argument that analogy is ultimately based on similarity, and as you know, any two things are infinitely similar or infinitely dissimilar. So there's no inferential logical way of deciding a similarity claim. It's just a matter of what's relevant. And then that gets me back to, it's psychologically indispensable because it's relevant to you to treat God personally, but because there's no logical way of deciding between similarities, there's no way in which you can make an argument for metaphysical necessity.
Okay.
So I want to go over that because that's an important argument, right? you have the analogy, but the analogy is based on, well, I'm going to treat these factors as relevant, right? But any two things, right? Similarity.
I'm curious, maybe it could be helpful to see, where do you see, let's say, this analogy breaking down in other theistic systems? For instance, Aquinas held that the ground of being was had intellect and will in a way that was analogical to us, and it was not the.
But it's proportional, and the problem, and this is, well, it's a problem for me. I don't know if it's a problem for you, which is, I'm aware of the mystical traditions that also undermine all of the claims of analogy, and even Aquinas talked about it being a proportional analogy, not a strict analogy, and that the proportionality was not something that could be given by the analogy, but it had to be given through revelation, right? And then it becomes.
We go back to miracles.
That's a doctrinal issue. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
I see. So at the ground, we sort of agree on that conception of the ground of being. Then there's an intermediate step of saying, okay, then we do analogies starting from that ground of being, and we can end up in different positions. Let's say Neoplatonism versus Eastern Christianity, for instance.
And also another non-theists. I mean, I mean, the strongest analogy in Eastern thought, like in Buddhism, is shunyata, is the analogy to space, to emptiness, rather than the analogy to personhood, because of the way non-being and emptiness, real possibility, play such a central role in their ontology. So, it's not the cup, but the emptiness in the cup that's useful, to quote the Tao Te Ching, right? And so they see that similarity as more relevant to their ontology, and so that's why they go into a non-theistic interpretation, and their analogy is a non-theistic analogy.
Okay, I see. So we first need to explain why the analogy of seeing consciousness in the ground of being, seeing relevance realization in the ground of being is a good analogy, and then we further need to explain how this aligns with the symbolism of Christianity.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm willing to acknowledge, like I just said, that because similarity is a relevance realization choice, that a theistic interpretation would be highly relevant to a person and make certain similarities apparent. But when you're like, what belongs together in a category changes in terms of your decisions about relevance. There's no logical way, and you can only establish metaphysical necessity in terms of some sort of logical argument. So I don't see how you can get beyond psychological indispensability to metaphysical necessity.
I see. So I'll need to find a way to make this point without hitting again the problems of, let's say, existential choices, which we've been discussing, or how are hitting also the wall of miracles again. I'll need to find some other way around those issues which we've already been discussing.
I mean,
question sure. I have, John. How would you define being?
How would I define being? So we're talking about being like with a big B as opposed to a being. Is that what you mean?
Right. How would you define being? Not a being, not a thing, but how would you define being?
So I would define being as the simultaneously self-presencing of intelligibility and the constant withdrawal of undisclosed possibility.
Okay. So it would, so that, if I understand you correctly, that is an act.
It's both an act and it's not an act, because I don't want to reduce possibility to actuality. So when I have to use act language, because our language is active, because we're right. So I would need some sort of passive thing, like it's the permeation of the field of possibility, which is a metaphor, of course. But all of these are going to be metaphors. You acknowledge that, because we're talking about being, which does not belong to any category. So I think that it's simultaneously the act of self-presencing. And here's where the analogy really comes in, because the self-presencing of my awareness is my most direct participatory symbol of the self-presencing of being. In fact, ontologically, phenomenologically, those become indistinguishable from me. So when I'm in deep meditation, sort of the self-presencing of being, if you want to put it that, and the self-presencing of my awareness, like the self-presencing of my awareness makes me aware of the self-presencing of being, but the self-presencing of being is what actually grounds the self-presencing of awareness. I think that's one side, but the self-presencing, right, the shining forth of intelligibility always is revealing the inexhaustibility of what's there to be more and more disclosed. So being is both the moreness, right? It's the self-presencing, but a self-presencing that always is disclosing the inexhaustibleness from which the self-presencing occurs. That's the best way I could try and articulate that.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that I would wonder about that is maybe using the word act is wrong, but there's an act. Let me put it this way: there's an activity, right?
Sure.
Okay, so
it's not temporal. We have to use temporal
right.
language for it.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be temporal, but there's an activity in this self-presencing
and withdrawal.
And withdrawal. Okay, and I would say you know that because it makes a difference to you.
Yes.
It's always relational.
To me or to itself? Which was, sorry.
Well, but I would say both, but it's always relational in that being is at the heart of everything that's in existence, or it's at the center of everything that's in existence. Because, okay, sure. So when you were giving one of your talks, you talked about inflation, and you said, you have to avoid inflation. I am. And I would say, right, remember saying that?
Yeah, I take that seriously.
But I would say, you can say I am as long as the I is you, but the am is God.
Well, maybe we're closer than you might think, because when I'm saying the self-presencing of my awareness is in deep continuity with the self-presencing of being, maybe that's kind of what you're saying. I don't know. It sounds to me like they're close to each other.
Yeah, I think so, because I think so. I think we're kind of good. I think we get hung up, or I'm going to say, I don't think we're hung up. I think you're hung up on that word person. I think person is the thing that, no blame in this. I think Christians should take all the blame for if having I'll go back to my initial point with you, if our believing in a personal God who's supposed to be love has made us behave in such an unloving manner that when we talk about a personal God, other people are repelled, we haven't done it right. Okay?
I want to first say I have deep respect and appreciation for your acknowledgement, but I want to say there's something. It's a big thing, so I'm not trying to dismiss it. But I want to bring back what I said to JP. It's also because I see that the analogy that's prevalent in the East is to something like emptiness, which doesn't seem to me to be personal, and yet it affords also great transformation, great wisdom, great karuna, great compassion in the people that have experienced shunyata. I've certainly had that experience about how that sort of reorients you in a fundamental way out of egocentrism and into a sense of how everything, what Thich Nhat Hanh says, how you experience everything as having interbeing, and that brings about a terrific kind of transformation in your capacity for compassion, for example.
So then, okay, and not having a deep familiarity.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you at a disadvantage, Mary.
Tradition. No. That's fine. I just want to say that I guess if a person, I would say it's still a personal encounter in some way, isn't it? I mean,
Well,
if you're
I mean,
what
depends.
is it that can transform you? Isn't it an encounter with, it's an encounter with love, isn't it?
Well, I mean, or I would say that the encounter is a love encounter. I tried to get that across the idea of within anagoge, and Platonism is a non-theistic framework, so I'm playing fair, right?
Right.
Right. You get the mutually accelerating disclosure. You have the reciprocal opening rather than the reciprocal narrowing, and I think human beings experience that as love, because that's how you basically can sort of induce people starting to fall in love with each other. That's what the work shows. So I think I think the experience of anagoge is an experience of being in love with something, and Plato clearly uses that language, but he doesn't think that that language of love and that language, right, of reciprocal opening means that there's some lover reciprocating the love. And that's also in Spinoza. Spinoza says the wise man desires nothing less than to have God love him in return, because he thought that was a fundamental mistake. And so I think I would say to you, Mary, and I understand we disagree, but I'm trying to respond to you honestly, that I think it's not an experience. I think the experience is of love rather than, right, and the experience of being loved.
It seems to me like both. Like there seems to be like two poles.
I mean, that goes back to Mary's point about gratitude, which I think is something we also have to talk about at some point.
Yeah, it seems to fit with what Jonathan said also about his analogy with the two swords, or with narrative. Like there, seems that God is always self-transcending himself as well. Where on the one end, there are three persons, but there's also one. There's something that is beyond the three persons.
Yeah, the erigena, the idea. Yeah. I mean, and see, I brought up with Jonathan that sounded sort of heretical to me in terms of the language of classical theism, because classical theism has tended to be deeply attached to a metaphysics of perfectionism, right, and understanding the ultimacy of God in terms of perfection. And that mistake I do attribute to Plato. So he's also been guilty of some what I consider a mistake of ideas that I think have misled us in some profound ways.
I think the problem might be in us being too definitional about God, as though we really know what we're saying when we say the words.
I agree with that.
Because even in the Christian mystical tradition, there's that cloud of unknowing. There's that, that which is beyond words, beyond description, beyond distinctions, beyond all of that. Sure. So,
I think I talked about that with Jonathan about Eckhart's prayer. God save me from God. In that sense that and Paul talks about that our conceptual structures can also ultimately be idols for us as well. So that's I mean, Calvin, the imagination is a permanent factory for the production of idols. My answer to that is we have to have as much as we can a self-correcting process to constantly make sure that our icons remain icons rather than becoming idols. And that's why I've tried to articulate a notion of the sacred as inexhaustible and evolving, as opposed to perfect and sort of graspable. I don't know where we're at. I do have to go soon, guys.
You already had to go.
We'll look forward to talking some other time.
If you guys put this together, I will commit right now to talking to you again. I've enjoyed this tremendously, and I felt this was genuine dialogos going on here. I think there was a lot of stuff happening, and a lot of good ground was covered. So I want to thank you both for being such insightful interlocutors and also having such tremendous integrity. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. How do you want to release this? I can put it on my channel. Maybe send it to Mary as well. I don't know if John, you want it also.
You just put it on your channel, and I'll link to it like I've done before.
Cool.
We want to try and get as many people coming to you guys' channel as possible, right?
Cool. Thank you.
So, well, we're all in this together. Yeah. We're all in this together in the
end. In opponent processing.
Okay. Yes, the best kind.
All right. Thank you, guys.
And Mary, once again, great pleasure getting to meet you and to spend some time in discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Likewise, John. Good night.
Talk soon.
Good night.